Welcome to this explainer. Today we're mapping out a truly fascinating and highly speculative theory straight from our source material. We're looking at a detailed argument that actually connects Elon Musk's massive corporate empire to the biblical mark of the beast. Yeah, you heard that right. We're going to look strictly at what the author claims, unpacking how they weave together ancient theology and futuristic tech. Now, our goal here isn't to endorse or debunk anything, but just to clearly and impartially lay out the architecture of this wild theory exactly as the text presents it.
Here's our quick roadmap for today. We'll start with the foundation, then move on to decoding the symbol X, the ubiquitous ecosystem, economy and biology, and finally wrap up with the spiritual dimension. Let's get into it.
Section 1. The Foundation, the Biblical Prophecy. So before we even touch modern tech, we really need to establish the baseline of the author's theory, which is the Book of Revelation. The text uses this specific biblical prophecy as its anchor. Basically, the Apostle John describes a future global system headed by a figure known as the Beast that exercises totally unprecedented control over commerce and human bodily autonomy. It dictates that literally no one can buy or sell with a specific mark. Now, the author of our source material argues that for centuries, people thought of this as just a spiritual metaphor or some way distant future problem. But they claim that today, the literal technological infrastructure needed to fulfill this exact prophecy is actively being built right in front of us.
Moving right along to Section 2, decoding the symbol X, from ancient mark to modern brand.
This is where the source starts linking ancient texts directly to today's headlines, and it's pretty wild. On the left side here, we have the ancient Hebrew word for mark, which is tav. Originally, this was written in the shape of an X or a cross, and it was used prophetically in texts like Ezekiel to denote a distinguishing mark on people. Now, look on the right. We have Elon Musk's super aggressive 2023 rebranding of Twitter into the X platform. The source draws a direct visual parallel here. They're suggesting that taking the ancient symbol for a mark and slapping it at the exact center of a sprawling digital platform, well, they see that as a profound prophetic alignment. But the linguistic parallels in the source material absolutely do not stop there. The text highlights a rather unsettling coincidence regarding the biblical number of the beast, 666. In ancient Greek, this number is represented by the letters chi, z, and sigma. When you transliterate those into English, they actually spell the word sex backwards. The text suggests this represents the self-idolatry characteristic of the beast system. Now, apply this to Musk's naming convention for Tesla's electric vehicles. You've got the Model S, the Model 3, which, you have to admit, closely resembles the Greek letter Z, and the Model X. The source argues that, whether this is completely intentional or just a crazy coincidence, it creates an undeniable and frankly eerie structural alignment with the ancient Greek representation of the beast's number.
Okay, on to Section 3. The ubiquitous ecosystem, pervading modern life.
This brings us to a massive shift in the source's argument. We're not just talking about symbols and brand names anymore. We're talking about physical infrastructure and global dominance. The author argues that Musk's companies aren't just independent, separate things. They actually form a highly coordinated ecosystem that dominates basically every essential facet of human existence. Think about it. Through X, there's a grip on global communication. Through SpaceX and Starlink, dominance over satellite internet and space. Tesla and the Boring Company tackle physical, everyday transit. And then there's Neuralink, aiming right at human cognition itself. The source posits that this insane consolidation of power across communication, transportation, and cognition is exactly the kind of inescapable infrastructure needed to run a global control mechanism.
Which leads us to Section 4, Economy and Biology, enforcing the system.
So the theory shifts from just mapping out this global infrastructure to identifying the specific enforcement mechanisms of this proposed control system. According to the text, this beast system isn't just dropped on us all at once. It rolls out sequentially. Step 1 is capturing global communication and discourse, which links to buying the X platform. Step 2 is capturing personal finance and transactions through something like X money. And the final ultimate step is crossing the biological barrier, demanding physical integration through tech like Neuralink. Let's zoom in on those last two steps because they are absolutely crucial to the author's whole thesis. Step 2 leans heavily on X money. The source argues that X money represents the exact economic control mentioned in Revelation. The inability to buy or sell without the mark. By transforming X into this massive everything app that integrates financial services, just imagine your entire economic participation being tethered to a single digital authority.
Think about having to rely on just one platform to buy your groceries, pay your rent, or even get your salary. From this perspective, a digital currency system capable of monitoring, regulating, and potentially cutting off your everyday purchases based on compliance, well, the author says that's actively under construction right now.
And then we have Neuralink, representing the third step, physical integration. Neuralink is, of course, a brain-computer interface company aiming to surgically implant microscopic threads and a processing chip directly into the human head. The author connects this directly, and I mean directly, to the specific biblical prophecy of a mark placed in the forehead. While it's currently being marketed as a totally voluntary, incredible medical breakthrough, the source material views it as a dark technological precursor. The core argument here is that this tech could eventually transition from being a voluntary cool gadget to a mandatory requirement for anyone wanting to participate in digital society, ultimately becoming the physical enforcement tool of the beast system itself.
Let's look at the final piece in Section 5, the spiritual dimension, the human element. So, how does all this cutting-edge technology tie back into the human and ultimately spiritual conclusions drawn by the source material? Because, at the end of the day, infrastructure is just metal and code, right? The author insists we have to look at the human element driving it. And this brings us to the absolute elephant in the room that the text directly tackles head-on. Given all these crazy parallels the author has laid out, do they actually believe Elon Musk himself is the Antichrist?
Believe it or not, the source argues no. The text actually contrasts the biblical description of the Antichrist with Elon Musk's current public standing. According to the book of Daniel, the Antichrist will be this highly charismatic figure who is well-liked by many, often thought of as a young guy rising super quickly to power. The author points out that Musk, on the flip side, is already deeply established, heavily polarizing, and a super controversial public figure who generates a ton of massive opposition. So the source concludes he really doesn't fit the biblical profile of that ultimate political and spiritual leader.
However, the author definitely does not let the overarching corporate culture off the hook. In fact, the text speculates that the ultimate Antichrist figure is highly likely to emerge from within Musk's corporate circle. To back this up, the source points to what it describes as alarming moral decay inside his companies. For instance, the text cites specific allegations against a former young Neuralink engineer who allegedly leaked company data and was accused of distributing illegal, deeply harmful content on Discord platforms. Now, while we obviously have to unequivocally condemn those alleged actions, the author is using these specific instances to argue that X.com and its surrounding culture are becoming increasingly characterized by toxic interactions and moral degradation. According to the source, these elements are essentially a dark, sneak preview of the cultural environment that will thrive under the finalized beast system.
This all brings us to the ultimate conclusion of the source's argument. The author states unequivocally that the biblical mark of the beast system is fundamentally an issue of worship, not merely advanced technology. And that's a really vital distinction, because while the X ecosystem might be building all the technological scaffolding, the communication networks, the digital money, the brain chips, technology all on its own cannot compel spiritual allegiance. The system, according to Scripture, will eventually demand that people consciously, willingly choose to worship the beast rather than God.
We're going to leave you with this final provocative thought derived straight from the explainer's source material. The author suggests that Elon Musk and his companies are simply the architects of a sprawling, inescapable framework. But if these corporate entities are merely building the digital and biological infrastructure, what happens when that ubiquitous system, the exact one you rely on for your money, your communication, and maybe eventually your very cognition, inevitably demands your ultimate spiritual choice? Will humanity willingly hand over its allegiance just to stay connected? It's a fascinating, terrifying question posed by the text, blending ancient scripture with the absolute cutting edge of modern tech. Thank you so much for joining us as we unpack this source material.